Thank you very much to Founding Forward for this invitation. Civic education is the reason I got my PhD, and so I'm very pleased about the existence of this group and others like it, and very honored to be invited to speak on John Dickinson, who, as I write these public addresses, I realize that John Dickinson was really the answer to my questions when I went to get my PhD to teach citizenship to students. So his life is a model of a civic educator. So I hope that you'll learn something, and I hope those of you who purchase the book enjoy it. And before I get started, I was requested to ask if there are any Dickinson College alumni in the audience. Okay, one? All right, usually in this part of the country it's more than that, but that's all right. Okay. In 1818, John Adams described the real revolution as radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affection of the people. In the same era, he specified that the revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775 in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington. Historians have long accepted Adams' assessment of events and individuals, even after they learned that he is an unreliable narrator. His positions were frequently out of step with prevailing sentiment. But following Adams, some historians have recently argued that the colonies were effectively independent as early as 1774. Though this patriotic narrative is compelling, it's winner's history, it doesn't do the story justice. It's only by telling about the losers in history, those dissenters whose agenda did not necessarily prevail, that we can begin to understand that events could well have unfolded differently, the road not taken. We thereby uncover the drama of history in the push and pull of opposing forces, the contingent nature of unfolding events, and the valuable lessons about not only what could have been, but even what should have been. In the usual story, John Dickinson is the biggest loser because he didn't want independence. We see this most clearly in works such as David McCullough's John Adams and the HBO miniseries based on it. But without Dickinson's story, there is no Adams story. Independence could not have been achieved without Dickinson, and you'll be amazed at not only what all he did, but all he got right. As we celebrate the semi-quincentennial of the Revolution, we should resist perpetuating a mythological version of our history. My claim is this: not only was America generally not aiming for independence until 1776, even as John Dickinson opposed the movement, paradoxically, he was more responsible than anyone for the creation of both the American identity and independence. No one did more to teach Americans about their rights, how to defend them, and how to be American. No one wrote more for the founding, held more offices, or was more present at critical junctures offering key ideas. This only sounds like fiction if you don't know his record. And few know his record because he's been excluded from the narrative of American history. Indeed, scholars have been so distracted by the fact that Dickinson didn't want independence and spoke against the Declaration that they've missed almost everything else he did and said. So for my time here this evening, I'll give an overview of Dickinson's career and the contributions that he made both before July 1776 and after that helped America actually achieve independence. Before we get into the revolution itself, I'll give you a little review of Dickinson's background. He was born in Maryland in 1732 to Quaker parents. His father, Samuel, was a wealthy planter and judge, and his mother, Mary, was highly educated, enough to read law books with her husband by the fireside. When John was 7, the family moved to Kent County in what is now Delaware, but at the time was Pennsylvania. Young John was educated by his parents and tutors in political history, political thought, the classics, literature, poetry, and the Bible. At the age of 18, he began an apprenticeship with the former king's attorney in Philadelphia. After he passed the bar at the age of 20, he departed for 3 years of deeper legal training at the Middle Temple in London, which is one of the Inns of Court. Here he reached the pinnacle of legal training as a barrister. He set the goal for himself to defend the innocent and redress the injured. While in England, in addition to the best legal training in the empire, he also gained something else, a sense that he was not really British, or not only British. He was something other and something more. He deeply missed his own land and people, and he began to feel that he was first and foremost an American. At the age of 21 or 22, long before anyone else, he became a patriot. Upon returning home in 1757, Dickinson began his own law practice and immediately began fulfilling his goals, standing up for the fundamental civil liberties of Americans. The first major case he had came in 1758, when the Reverend William Smith asked Dickinson to defend him against charges of libel by the Legislative Assembly of Pennsylvania. It was a sham trial to prosecute a political opponent. The Assembly had arrested Smith without a warrant and then denied him due process. But at only 26 years old, Dickinson rose to the challenge, bravely resisting the Assembly's unlawful behavior and speaking truth to power despite threats of arrest. I'd like to read a remarkable quote to show you what I mean. I won't make you follow along on that. Freedom of the press is truly inestimable. It is the preserver of every other freedom and the antidote to every kind of slavery. By the assistance of the press, the language of liberty flies like lightning through the land, and when the least attack is made upon her rights, spreads the alarm to all her sons and rouses a whole people in her cause. His conclusion was this: freedom of the press is so opposite and dreadful to the usurpers of unjust power and the enemies of mankind that liberty, however maimed and wounded, still breathes and struggles while that prevails. Dickinson's law practice flourished. He took all manner of cases, from small debt collection and assisting illiterate farmers with their wills to lucrative cases in the Court of Admiralty defending American merchants. He also defended the poorest people from heinous charges. When his clients were accused murderers, he worked pro bono so as not to be seen as profiting from a crime. And he represented individuals most lawyers wouldn't touch, such as the mixed-race servant woman, Rachel Francisco, accused of infanticide. He was a champion for the underdog. He took this same sensibility with him when he entered first the legislature of Pennsylvania's 3 lower counties, now Delaware, and then the Pennsylvania Assembly, writing and passing legislation to assist those whose rights needed protecting, whether it was free African Americans kidnapped by whites into slavery, German immigrants taken advantage of by unscrupulous sea captains, or Native Americans massacred by white frontiersmen. Now that you have some background on Dickinson, let's return to the Revolutionary era. To begin, independence was not inevitable, but it was foreseeable. Almost a decade before John Adams looked beyond Massachusetts in 1774 and recognized that there was a colony-wide conflict with Britain, Dickinson foresaw separation from Britain and began working simultaneously against the movement for independence and for America's survival as an independent nation. An astute observer of political behavior with remarkable prescience, Dickinson was a master strategist. He anticipated America's actions and British reactions, as well as Americans' strengths and failings, and he implemented tactics and policies to enhance the one and mitigate the other. With his Quaker background and the best legal education in the empire, he offered solutions that no other American could, and came to be seen around the Atlantic world and as far away as Poland as the spokesman for the American cause. Historians generally describe the resistance as arising organically and spontaneously, leaderlessly throughout the colonies. This is true in the earliest years, along with a significant amount of confusion and flailing. Indignation about unjust taxation ran high in 1764 and 65, which resulted in widespread actions of various sorts. Outraged elites wrote pamphlets to one another with theories justifying their outrage. Some helpful slogans emerged: no taxation without representation, and some unhelpful ones: internal versus external taxation. Try to define it, I dare you. Some authors denied Parliament's rights to legislate, others affirmed it. They mostly spoke in limited terms of the rights of Englishmen. Assemblies mobilized, committees of correspondence formed, and Sons of Liberty organized. These extra-legal groups were important, but they had their limits. First, the committees were seen as temporary solutions to momentary problems and would disband when the immediate objective was met, an indication that the colonists did not understand fully the extent of the problems with Great Britain. Second, their tools were few and ineffective. They advocated non-importation, which could be effective given enough time, but they couldn't boycott goods that they couldn't manufacture themselves, like paper. When the colonists proved impatient, the Sons of Liberty, the thuggish arm of the resistance, turned to violence, rioting and threatening individuals. No elite person stepped forward to put forth a theory of resistance and lead the people because all they had in their toolbox was the Whig or Lockean theory of revolution, which said that a people could overthrow a tyrannical government and create a new one. But no one was there yet in 1765, or in the 1760s at all. Ultimately, the committees were a headless creature whose tentacles reached far but lacked the direction provided by a central intelligence. Dickinson became that central intelligence. He first led the 1765 Stamp Act Congress, drafting its two documents, the Petition to the King and the Declaration of Rights, in which he insisted on the radical language of natural rights. Then, as violence spread down the coast from New England, he noticed a void in the leadership that, if not filled, would cause events to spiral out of control. No one was speaking to ordinary Americans or offering concrete suggestions for how they should act. He therefore explained to them in a short and simple broadside why the Stamp Act precedent was dangerous and what they should do about it. He offered a strategy pioneered by the pacifist Quakers in their struggle for religious liberty: civil disobedience. Now let's be clear about what that means. It is the public, nonviolent breaking of unjust laws with the intent of raising awareness of the injustice and creating change from the ground up. By these means, the colonists would repeal the offending law virtually, which would ultimately compel Parliament to repeal it actually. The broadside was well received, and Dickinson's advice was adopted by the Sons of Liberty, among other groups. Civil disobedience was only the first Quaker tactic that Dickinson brought to the conflict. The next was mediation, a service Quakers had been offering their non-Quaker neighbors for decades. Continuing work he had begun as a Pennsylvania legislator, he built coalitions, united hostile factions, and explained to one party the position of the other, frequently by adopting pseudonymous personas to appear neutral or empathetic. After his broadside to ordinary Americans, he wrote a pamphlet directed to the British elite to explain why the new taxation policy was damaging both to the colonists and to the economy of Great Britain. Shortly thereafter, he wrote to the Conservative Committee of Correspondence in Barbados to explain why the resistance techniques he advocated were not rebellious. Most tellingly, in a 1765 letter to William Pitt, he detailed the potentially devastating consequences if Britain persisted in the new policy, namely that the colonies would seek independence. Moreover, he warned they would succeed. What he feared was their eventual disintegration into, quote, multitude of commonwealths, crimes, and calamities, centuries of mutual jealousies, hatreds, wars, and devastations, till at last the exhausted provinces shall sink into slavery under the yoke of some fortunate conqueror. In contrast with Dickinson's prescience in 1765 about the coming of the Revolution is John Adams' account of his own powers of prognostication. As late as 1773, Adams was actually still clueless about what the near future held, writing, "We shall oscillate like a pendulum and fluctuate like the ocean for many years to come. Our children may see revolutions and be concerned and active in effecting them, of which we can form no concept." In 1773. Yet decades later, when revolution seemed inevitable, John Adams advised historians how best to investigate the drastic change in the American people. He said, newspapers in all the colonies ought to be consulted during that period to ascertain the steps by which the public opinion was enlightened and informed concerning the authority of Parliament over the colonies. I'm so glad he suggested it, because that is precisely how we know that Dickinson dominated the pre-independence narrative. From the end of 1767 on, the newspapers were full of items by, to, and about Dickinson. The evidence unfolds as clearly as can be. Yet historians have overlooked it because before newspapers were digitized, it was easy to miss if you weren't searching for it. And almost no one was because of the Dickinson-shaped blind spot. After the Stamp Act was repealed, and then the Townshend Acts were passed in 1767, most Americans had stopped paying attention to British measures. The committees of correspondence had disbanded, and the Sons of Liberty were dormant. Dickinson alone saw clearly that these new taxes were intended to test the efficacy of the 1766 Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament could legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Towards the end of the year, when there were still no protests, Dickinson felt compelled to act and published what would become his most famous work, The Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. With his 1765 broadside, Dickinson's aim was to empower the American people, to educate them about their rights and how to defend them peacefully in order to prevent oppression, violence, and separation from Great Britain. Significantly, the farmers' letters encouraged Americans in the single most important thing that would allow them to reform British policy and, should that goal fail, enable them to survive as an independent nation: unity. That unity would be based on their distinct American identity. This is the radical change that John Adams meant, but it was far from solidified in 1768. Or 1776. To reiterate and correct a common misperception, one thing the farmers' letters pointedly did not do was advocate revolution. Dickinson wanted reconciliation. The responses to the farmer, as Dickinson was then known, began after the first letter appeared. In December 1767, the Massachusetts Assembly, led by Samuel Adams, hastened to follow his advice by issuing the famed circular letter that organized the colonies into a concerted resistance effort. The town of Boston then thanked the farmer for the inspiration. From then on, a deluge of tributes in the form of letters of gratitude, dedicated poems and pamphlets, physical depictions, advertisements for goods and services invoked the farmer, and more poured in from around the colonies. These 12 letters launched Dickinson to international celebrity. And yes, he was much more famous than even Benjamin Franklin, as the person who taught them how to recognize and defend their rights. His star status and his message was solidified in the summer of 1768 when he published the Liberty Song, America's first patriotic song, containing a line that became America's first national motto as it was repeated in the newspapers and public assemblies: "By uniting we stand, by dividing we fall." At this point, with most colonies united solidly behind the non-importation agreement, he targeted the reluctant Quakers who controlled Pennsylvania and got them on board. From 1768 to 1776, no one had more power or influence in America than the Pennsylvania farmer. Time and again, local leaders in other colonies looked to him for guidance. after the so-called Boston Massacre in 1770, when attorneys John Adams and Josiah Quincy defended the British soldiers, they closed by quoting the farmer, chiding their fellow Bostonians for ignoring his directives for peaceful protest. In 1771, when Son of Liberty Alexander McDougall in New York was accused of libel by the Provincial Assembly for criticizing their approval of funds for quartering British troops, he requested Dickinson's services as defense attorney. After the Rhode Islanders boarded and burned the British schooner Gaspee in 1772, fearing reprisals from the British, the panicked assembly wrote to Dickinson begging his advice. And Richard Henry Lee of Virginia also sought Dickinson's opinion on the matter. After Samuel Adams led the 1773 Boston Tea Party, he sheepishly wrote to Dickinson, hoping that the coercive acts were not punishment for how they had imprudently acted. They were. In 1774, Arthur Lee implored Dickinson to take up his pen and again advise Americans how to behave as the coercive acts went into effect, which he did, writing 4 more letters to the American people reiterating his pleas for peaceful protest. Calls for a colony-wide Congress began in the spring of 1774. With Pennsylvania the geographical, economic, and cultural center of British North America, logically the Congress should meet there. Other leaders only awaited Dickinson's approval, but Pennsylvania was becoming increasingly polarized. On the one hand, the Quakers who controlled the Pennsylvania Assembly were retreating into neutrality. On the other, the radicals, consisting largely of Scotch-Irish Presbyterian laborers, enemies of the Quaker elite and fond of threatening them, were increasingly considering violence in solidarity with Boston. Dickinson was the only leader whom all factions trusted. With the help of allies such as Charles Thompson, he unified them in favor of peaceful protest, established a shadow government to bypass the Quaker Assembly, and secured support for hosting the First Continental Congress. The farmer was the main attraction for the delegates from other colonies. Lesser-known figures, Patrick Henry, George Washington, Josiah Quincy, and John Adams sought introductions and tried to learn about the details of his life. None was more starstruck than Adams, who gushed about Dickinson in his diary. When Congress convened, Dickinson's agenda for reconciliation and resistance dominated, despite his not being seated as a delegate until the last few days. While Samuel Adams considered Dickinson a true Bostonian, Cousin John became increasingly disgruntled when Dickinson's draft of key documents supplanted his own. Thus began Adams' decades-long campaign to discredit Dickinson and his achievements, or take credit for them himself. Dickinson's prowess as a strategist and charismatic leader is evident in 1775 and 76, when his tactic shifted from preventing independence to delaying it, and when pushback from the radicals, with Adams in the lead, began to intensify. After the opening of the Second Congress in May 1775, shortly after Lexington and Concord, Dickinson's popularity was stronger than ever, as evinced by people using his name to advertise their goods and services. Ships, American-made cloth, a stud horse. After the opening session, congressmen questioned their purpose: reconciliation or independence. Adams himself proclaimed America's loyalty to the crown. As the undisputed leader of that body, Dickinson offered 3 ways they could proceed. First, they could seek reconciliation. Second, they could prepare for war. And third, they could do both and send agents to negotiate with Britain. Dickinson advised the third option, and that's what he got. Congress voted unanimously for a second petition to the king and a declaration on taking up arms, and they passed the resolution to send agents. After John Jay and Thomas Jefferson took stabs at the petition and declaration respectively, Dickinson stepped in to rewrite both into their final forms. The petition had been too strong and the declaration too weak. Though people are generally confused when they learn that Dickinson wrote both documents, especially since Jefferson claimed credit for the Declaration, it was, as one of my students described it, a chess move. The so-called Olive Branch Petition served multiple purposes: as a last attempt for reconciliation, to gauge the temper of the ministry, to buy time to prepare for war, and as legal cover for war and independence, proof to the world that the colonists had done all they could do to prevent these things. Dickinson's main purpose with the Declaration was the same as that of the petition: to prevent war, this time by creating such apprehensions in the British that they wouldn't dare attack. Should that fail, the other purpose was to rouse a martial spirit and patriotic sentiment in the newly formed Continental Army. Both documents worked as planned. Meanwhile, John Adams struggled to understand Dickinson's plan. Even as he voted for Dickinson's proposals and praised his participation in the military in letters home, he was confused by Dickinson's multi-pronged strategy for peace. On the one level, he seemed to understand the benefits of delaying all-out war and independence. On the other, negotiating the finer points of maintaining peace eluded him and made him impatient. Waging war is easy. Securing the peace is difficult, and the peacemakers are always attacked. In one of the most famous moments of this era, Adams wrote a letter calling Dickinson a piddling genius and blaming him for allegedly making Congress look silly. This letter was intercepted and published by the British, and most historians now use it as evidence that Dickinson was in the minority and out of touch with reality. But the opposite was true. Congress was behind Dickinson. Yet, historians have ignored the context in favor of winner's history. Not only did Adams later recant the insult, at the time he was motivated less by anything Dickinson did or didn't do and more by his own frustrations. He was mainly annoyed by his fellow Massachusetts delegates about their lack of unity. He was sick, nearly blind, and felt miserable much of the summer, and he confessed that he was deeply jealous of Dickinson's success in leading Congress. He thus had no real reason to attack Dickinson, but plenty of motive. A great example of the bad history perpetuated by the Adams cult comes from historian Joseph Ellis. He claims that after the Olive Branch Petition was rejected, quote, Dickinson was understandably silent since the diplomatic path forward he had hoped to blaze had become a dead end. Ellis continues, by the late fall of 1775, Dickinson had become the chief spokesman for those reluctant American patriots who did not know what to do. Well, in reality, Dickinson was laser-focused on preparing for war. First, he wrote military policy. He worked on the Committee of Safety to root out and punish traitors and prepare the defense of Philadelphia by sinking barricades in the Delaware River. And as the commander of the 1st Philadelphia Battalion of Associators, he possessed de facto control of the entire Pennsylvania militia. Considering that this was one of the largest military forces in the colonies, combined with Dickinson's political influence in Congress and over public opinion, no man in America was more powerful than he was at that moment. The very sight of him cutting a dashing figure in his military uniform prompted young men to enlist. When John Adams complained more than once that the British viewed Dickinson as the ruler of America, it wasn't mere hyperbole. Second, in the fall of 1775, as Adams encouraged congressional delegates to reform their respective colonial legislatures into Republican governments in anticipation of independence, Dickinson countered in November with one of the most important documents before the 1776 Declaration: instructions to the Pennsylvania delegates to Congress forbidding them to vote on independence. With this move, Dickinson single-handedly halted any revolutionary movement. Without Pennsylvania, nothing could happen. Yet, this was not any arbitrary expression of Dickinson's will. It was the will of his constituents. Only a few days before he wrote these instructions, Quakers and radicals in Pennsylvania battled with petitions over support for the militia. The Quakers refused, and the radicals objected to their refusal. But on one key issue, they were in agreement. Even as the radicals demanded military resistance to Britain, they still expressed fealty to the British monarchy. Thus, no significant group in Pennsylvania wanted revolution or independence. Dickinson wasn't done with his previous efforts on all fronts. Next, he stopped the New Jersey Assembly from making concessions to the British. He continued to plan for sending agents to negotiate, and he volunteered to lead his battalion to New York to fight the British. And he facilitated an alliance with the Lenape people. The tipping point towards revolution came with Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which moved the debate out of Congress and into the public. When events conspired in spring of 1776 to convince Dickinson that a declaration could no longer be resisted, he took steps to allow it to go forward and to do so as safely as possible. In June and July, he wrote and published several documents. One was new instructions to the Pennsylvania delegates in Congress, permitting them to vote their consciences. This document was the main thing that Congress had been waiting for and what allowed independence to move forward. But now that Dickinson allowed it to happen, he wanted to implement safeguards for the American people. His biggest fear, and the main reason he didn't want independence, was that he knew that in spite of Americans' talk about rights, there weren't yet constitutions and laws in place to protect those rights. There was no constitution for the new United States, nor was there one for Pennsylvania. Until now, the religious dissenters, primarily the Quakers in Pennsylvania, were protected under the colonial constitution that had been in place since 1701. With hostile political factions rampant in Pennsylvania, not to mention other chronic issues, Dickinson worried about the Quakers and other vulnerable Americans, so he tried to create protections for them. Most significantly, he wrote the first draft of America's new Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, with two notable provisions: one for a strong central government to which the states would be subordinate, and a religious liberty clause for dissenters that protected in particular women's freedom of worship and their freedom of public speech. This attempt to protect women's rights was the most radical move of the Revolution. Let's not forget that John Adams laughed at Abigail when she asked him to remember the ladies when protecting rights for all men. Then Dickinson wrote the same provision into an essay on a frame of government for Pennsylvania. Also, both the Articles of Confederation and this essay contained language about abolishing slavery. Evidence of his further attempt to protect rights is in his edits to the Pennsylvania Declaration of Rights. The radical revolutionaries who wrote it were neither legislators nor lawyers, which means they didn't really know how to craft constitutions, nor did they care about the rights of minorities. And they considered the pacifist Quakers as their political enemies. So Dickinson took a pen to the document, rewriting key provisions and adding new ones. On the provision for liberty of press, for example, he rewrote it to say that it's one of the great bulwarks of liberty, and therefore ought not to be restrained. And there were not enough protections for religious dissenters, so he added a clause prohibiting religious tests that would prevent them from holding office and exercising civic duties. He also sought to ensure the rights of due process. He added language to the effect that no freeman ought to be taken or imprisoned or disseised of his freehold, liberties, or privileges, or outlawed or exiled in any manner, destroyed or deprived of his life, liberty, or property, but by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. On the matter of warrants, he wrote that any attempt to search places or seize any person or persons, his or their property, without a warrant are contrary to the rights of the people and ought not to be granted. These passages about due process were basic. They were uncontroversial assertions of historic rights that Americans had always enjoyed, but they were not adopted. All of these provisions were intended to replace the British Constitution Americans were about to cast aside, and to prevent the calamities that Dickinson saw so clearly as a consequence of independence. Despite Dickinson's central role at this moment, here is how he is represented in the most famous painting of the Second Continental Congress. There he is, way in the background. In his speech against independence on July 1st, he reiterated all the ways America was unprepared. Like his draft of the Articles of Confederation, his colleagues rejected his concerns. Then, knowing the vote would be in favor of independence, Dickinson stepped aside to ensure the vote would be unanimous. This is where most histories of Dickinson end. After beginning with the farmers' letters as a call for revolution, historians are at a loss to explain Dickinson's stance on independence. So they project their confusion onto him, finding not only that he was conflicted, indecisive, and lacking in nerve, but even worse, lacking in honor and integrity. Some try to rescue him by calling him conservative, which is entirely nonsensical given Dickinson's record of supporting the French Revolution. And even in America, he used moderate means to achieve radical ends. The simplest and most obvious explanation for Dickinson's refusal to vote on independence was the reason he himself gave at the time and later, that America was unprepared. Another reason has to do with his sophisticated Quaker constitutional theory, but that is not strictly necessary to understand his actions at this most basic level. So, insofar as Dickinson's efforts did delay the Declaration by at least 8 months, John Adams praised the delay, claiming it had cemented American unity. But he was wrong. More than a few of Dickinson's fears stemming from American unpreparedness and disunity came to pass. Moreover, it's important to keep in mind that American independence was not achieved with the Declaration, nor was it secured with the end of the Revolutionary War. It remained precarious, arguably until the War of 1812. So for my remaining time, I'll give the highlights of Dickinson's career after the Declaration, showing that no individual did more to secure Americans' independence or to realize the principles stated in the Declaration. Most remarkably, not only did Dickinson's final speech on independence predict many of the calamities the nation would face in the next years, Dickinson himself played a central role in mitigating them. Before I begin with those, however, I'll mention one key thing. In his speech against independence, Dickinson made a remarkable prediction. He said, "Great Britain, after one or more unsuccessful campaigns, may be induced to redress all the grievances complained of in our first petition of 1774. And that is exactly what happened. In the spring of 1778, after the British had faced a disastrous loss in the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, the so-called Carlisle Commission arrived in Philadelphia to negotiate an end to the war. It offered Americans suspension of all parliamentary acts concerning the colonies since 1763 and representation of America in Parliament. By then, of course, it was too late. Even Dickinson had given up. Now he demanded British recognition of American independence, and he devoted the rest of his life to securing it and the basic rights of all Americans to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Since I can only give the highlights of the offices that Dickinson held and the work he did for the American people, I'm going to focus on the things that he did more at the national level than particular states. First, mere days after independence was declared, he went to battle, leading his battalion to the front to meet the British. He was one of only 2 members of Congress to go into the field. Although his unit was deactivated shortly before the Battle of Long Island in August 1776, his superior officers recognized and commended his service. Nor was he finished. The following summer, he did something no other gentleman of his wealth and stature did. He enlisted as a private in the Delaware militia. In that role, he requisitioned supplies and deployed to deter a British invasion, mobilized to control the Delaware River. As he was still shouldering a musket for his country, at the end of the summer of 1777, Congress and the Pennsylvania government fulfilled Dickinson's worst fear for an independent America. Following ideas planted by Thomas Paine, suspicious papers mysteriously surfaced from a supposed Quaker meeting, allegedly proving that they were aiding the British. Congress, prompted by John Adams, ordered the Pennsylvania government to arrest leading Quakers in Philadelphia, which they did without warrant. Several of the men were relatives of Dickinson's wife. Then, with no charges, They were eventually exiled to Virginia, where their lives were lost and livelihoods destroyed. With no religious liberty clause in the new Pennsylvania Constitution, inadequate provisions for due process, and no United States Constitution in place at all, there were no protections for religious dissenters. Quakers faced other persecutions as well, including being harassed in the streets and their property vandalized and destroyed. When over 130 Loyalists turned themselves in to the Pennsylvania authorities under an act of attainder, the only two who were executed were the two Quakers. Had Dickinson's pre-independence concerns and work been heeded, this most shameful moment in the Revolution might have been averted. In 1779, Dickinson was returned to Congress by Delaware. That was the most dysfunctional year of Congress during the war. Sectionalism, factionalism, and personal jealousies caused members to fight amongst themselves. President John Jay was relieved when Dickinson arrived because he was one of the few men with the knowledge and experience to manage the issues they faced. Over the next 9 months, Dickinson stepped in to manage all manner of crises. The first 3 issues he tackled were all existential threats to the Union: the financial situation, including non-payment of taxes by individuals and states, as well as corruption by government officials; confusion in marine affairs, namely the Navy, maritime trade, and maritime law; and stagnant peace negotiations. By the end of his term, he had served on around 25 committees, putting in place new regulations to address the problems. Dickinson had only a short break before he was again called into service in Delaware. When he assumed the presidency in 1781, Delaware was a failing state. Its economy, stymied by Tory traders, terrorized the inhabitants, its courts were ineffectual, its militia was in disarray. In fact, only months before Dickinson took office, Tory raiders plundered his estate outside Dover, and the militia arrived only after they were long gone. But when he took office, the first thing he did was draft an extensive bill reorganizing the entire militia. His vision was unique. Rather than thinking of this as a fighting force like a provincial militia, responsible for protecting only little Delaware, Dickinson imagined it as a force that might be called upon by the central government to join in defending the United States as a whole. In other words, he anticipated what became the National Guard. And he didn't stop writing with this bill. He then wrote a drill manual for the troops based on the famous manual Baron von Steuben presented to General Washington, adding his own essay on Republican principles in an introduction. Then he personally reviewed the troops to ensure they met his standards. His colonels praised him as their units transformed into an efficient fighting force and a model for other state militias. Dickinson did the same for the rest of the state systems. Before his first year as president of Delaware was finished, he was elected president of Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council. Not only was this one of the largest and most powerful states in the Union with its own uniquely challenging problems, it was also the seat of the dysfunctional United States government. Moreover, the two governments were weirdly related to one another. Both governments met in the same building, the Pennsylvania State House, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was also more or less the United States Supreme Court. So when Dickinson assumed the presidency of the Executive Council, that meant he was also the head of the Pennsylvania judiciary, so the United States judiciary. In short, as president of Pennsylvania, Dickinson was once again one of the most powerful men in America. His role as commander-in-chief of Pennsylvania was even more dramatic than in Delaware. He managed several potentially explosive matters by de-escalating rather than inflaming the situations. In his speech against independence, he warned that the British would loose Indians on our frontier. In 1783, within months of Dickinson's taking office, continued clashes between native peoples and Pennsylvanians on the frontier signaled that the Indians were unaware of the recent peace treaty between Britain and the United States. They continued to kill Americans. They were also uninformed that Britain would cede Western lands to the Americans. Rather than responding with military force, Dickinson instructed commissioners from Pennsylvania to negotiate a treaty with the Indians that would deal with them fairly and respectfully. The following year, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix was concluded. Now, although it did avert bloodshed, and it seemed to Dickinson that the Indians were satisfied that justice had been done, we now know that the treaty was not respectful. Rather, it manipulated them into giving up too much land, which devastated their nations in the long run. Yet another incident happened in 1783. In the Newburgh conspiracy in New York, George Washington de-escalated a potential mutiny by Continental soldiers disgruntled about being discharged without pay or pensions. Dickinson did the same in a more volatile situation. Known as the Mutiny of 1783, Continental soldiers marched on the State House and threatened Dickinson's life if they didn't receive redress of their grievances. They were apparently encouraged by members of Congress seeking an excuse to depart Philadelphia, one of whom was Alexander Hamilton. Congress demanded that Dickinson call out the Pennsylvania militia to quell the uprising, but Dickinson refused, knowing that doing so would only escalate the situation. Instead, he demanded the leaders appear before him and then scolded them for their disrespect. The soldiers immediately apologized and departed peacefully. Dickinson's handling of the incident, along with his own military service and his advocacy for veterans of the Revolutionary War, led him to be admitted as an honorary member in the Society of the Cincinnati, which was normally restricted to officers in the Continental Army. Another of Dickinson's primary concerns expressed in his speech against independence was that Americans did not know on what grounds we are to stand with regard to one another. He meant the states, and he believed that there should be a constitution or at least treaties between them to prevent hostilities. But there was nothing, so what happened in Pennsylvania was entirely predictable. Long-standing tensions between Pennsylvania land speculators and Connecticut settlers in Pennsylvania's Wyoming Valley erupted in a full-fledged civil war in 1784. This situation was actually something Dickinson had been dealing with since the colonial era. Again, he did not want to call out the militia. This time, a fundamental principle was at stake, that the military should never be deployed against civilians, and instead there should be a civil police force. Dickinson's strategy was successful. Without militias to assist the Pennsylvanians, eventually the conflict subsided. But it was a stark reminder that Americans needed an umpire. President Dickinson also managed two tense legal situations that foreshadowed issues that would arise in the Federal Convention a few years later. The first concerned legal due process for alleged criminals. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court declared a man named Aaron Doane to be an outlaw, which meant he would be executed without a trial by a jury of his peers. But when Doane was captured, Dickinson refused to sign his death warrant without due process, defying his longtime friend Thomas McCain, who was then Chief Justice. But Dickinson's was the view of the future. Bills of attainder, otherwise known as outlawry, were banned in the U.S. Constitution. At the end of Dickinson's presidency of Pennsylvania in 1785, he advocated a number of changes that he would like to see in Pennsylvania and the nation. In Pennsylvania, he hoped for laws that would protect vulnerable individuals. He wanted pensions for veterans protected, he wanted women to be allowed to divorce and receive alimony, and he wanted prison reform. Most importantly, however, he wanted the weak and ineffective Articles of Confederation to be amended. An incident in Massachusetts the following year highlighted the need for change. In the summer of 1786, Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts was sparked when political corruption led to a debt crisis and farmers rebelled. Initial efforts to use the militia to quell the rebellion led to the members of the militia joining the rebels, justifying Dickinson's refusal to call out the militia during the Mutiny of 1783. The incident made many people realize that American liberty and liberties could not be preserved under the Articles of Confederation as ratified. The immediate result was the Annapolis Convention in the fall of 1786. Dickinson attended as a delegate from Delaware, where he served with a couple of youngsters, Hamilton and Madison. He was immediately named chairman of the convention, which made sense considering he was the elder statesman, and he had, of course, drafted the first version of the Articles 20 years prior. It turned out that there were not enough delegates to amend the Articles, so instead they called for a constitutional convention the following year. Dickinson's letter to Congress with the call was read in February 1787. Dickinson's critical role in creating the United States Constitution has been underappreciated, to say the least. There he is, way in the back. But listen to what he did. Despite his being ill for most of the convention, he participated all summer, offering key contributions that made our government what it is today. He offered his insights and arguments on many topics, but I'll mention just 3 of them now. First and most importantly, he provided the solution to the main problem facing the convention: what representation in Congress should look like. I believe Dickinson had been thinking about this issue from the earliest moments of his career, and certainly since the controversy with Britain began. But there is hard evidence that he had the fundamental principle in mind as early as 1782. At that time, when he was president of Delaware, and then a couple of years later during his Pennsylvania presidency, he depicted the relationship between the United States government and the states like a solar system, with the central government as the sun being orbited by the states like planets. He brought this metaphor to the Federal Convention when he described how representation should work, that one branch of Congress should represent the states equally, while the other should represent the people proportionally, effectively solving the problem of divided sovereignty that led to the revolution in the first place. At first, the convention ignored his idea. Poor Benjamin Franklin was confused by the entire thing, and he broke secrecy in Congress, broke the secrecy of the convention to make fun of the idea to some friends, likening it to a snake with 2 heads. But then he was actually on the committee that eventually adopted the idea, which we now call the Connecticut Compromise. The second area where Dickinson made notable contributions is on the issue of slavery. He was one of the few delegates to speak against slavery on moral grounds. He himself had recently freed all of the black men, women, and children he enslaved, the only leading founder to do so during his lifetime. And he was now attempting to get slavery abolished in Delaware. So when his former law clerk, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, suggested the notorious 3/5 clause, Dickinson opposed it, saying, "What will be said of this new government, of founding a right to govern freemen on a power derived from slaves, themselves incapable of governing, yet giving to others what they have not?" Later in the proceedings, he made the motion to abolish the slave trade, which became Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. He finally made a subtle but important change in the wording of the Fugitive Slave Clause. As proposed, it would have said, "No person legally held to service or labor in one state escaping into another," and so on. He wanted the word legally struck because he didn't believe that the laws upholding slavery were legal. I have since discovered that Dickinson referenced the illegitimacy of slave laws in other places as well. And why is this seemingly insignificant alteration of one word important? It was a seed of liberty planted by the Pennsylvania farmer for future generations, and it almost blossomed. In his dissent to the famous 1857 Dred Scott decision, Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Curtis cited Dickinson's exact language to show that the framers did not see black people inherently as slaves. Finally, I'll mention a couple of things Dickinson didn't get, because no one got everything he wanted in the convention. During deliberations concerning the executive, Dickinson made it clear that he thought an executive committee like the one he presided over in Pennsylvania would be the safest and least like a monarchy. When it was apparent that the convention would create a single executive with potentially much more power, he argued that this individual ought to be elected by popular vote. But that wouldn't happen either. Dickinson was then assigned to the committee that devised the Electoral College, but he was ill and unable to attend until it was adjourning. The members informed him of their conclusions, one of which was that Congress would choose the electors. But Dickinson objected to that as making the executive too dependent on the legislative branch. Instead, he suggested that the electors be chosen by the people in the states, which is currently how it's done. After the convention, Dickinson did what he'd been doing for most of his life. He wrote letters to ordinary Americans to explain to them how the Constitution worked and why they should ratify it. Using the pen name Fabius, Dickinson's 9 letters were published in the newspapers in several states and won the admiration of soon-to-be President George Washington. They focused on the democratic character of the new Constitution and the importance of virtuous participation of all Americans. In retirement, Dickinson then backed up his words by using his vast wealth to found schools for poor and orphan children and other institutions for civic education, some of which still exist today. He continued working for the American people in other ways, founding the first prison reform system, leading protest groups, publishing pamphlets on current affairs, and writing and advocating legislation for Delaware, Pennsylvania, and the United States until he died in 1808. Reintroducing Dickinson into the narrative compels us to reconsider the road to independence. Both before and after Congress declared separation from Britain, it turns out that it was mainly Dickinson's road after all. He advocated steadfast resistance to oppression and advocacy of rights through nonviolence, power in the people, unity and constitutional perpetuity through a strong federal government, protection for individual rights. Although we took a detour into revolution and loose confederation, we eventually returned to his road. It took us just a few years, or a couple of centuries, to get there. So Dickinson may be the biggest winner of all, but this is not the end of history. The question we must now consider is, will we stay on his road? Thank you very much.
Dr. Calvert, thank you for the fascinating talk tonight. I received many, many questions from the audience, but unfortunately we are out of time, so
no.
I will
I went too long.
I will leave them with you. Maybe I'll give you one before we
please
break.
do.
How about, okay. This is kind of a summary of a few questions in one. Did Dickinson harbor any regret, and what did he misunderstand about the revolutionary moment, if anything?
He did not harbor regret. I think I seem to recall he was glad that he was wrong, that America did prevail and survive. He owned his decision. He was approached by a painter who wanted to paint him, at the signing of the Declaration, and he declined more than once, saying that I was not there and I did not have anything to do with it, and don't put me in there. But he always owned it. And what did he misunderstand? I don't know. It was a good question. I'm not sure he misunderstood much. I think he foresaw the difficulties and tried at every step to kind of alleviate the uncertainty and protect rights. I think that I don't know. That I'll have to ponder that a little bit. That's a challenging question.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Dr. Jane Calvert.